We're live, we're going to crack on now. So I'm still talking to Paul Riley from the University of Sheffield. And we spoke a little bit about your research project around the use of the hashtag, the Troubles, which again, you know, is really last sort of quite a modern technology, really. Things like, you know, Instagram and stuff over the last sort of 6 or 7 years. Really interesting. And again, it's a way of engaging young people in history in a very different way. Now, the question I want to ask you is obviously related to education and how we teach history that relates to things that are not old, but kind of almost like, you know, could be current affairs, really. Sort of, you know, I often think that World War I and World War II are still current affairs because of the impact that it had on Brexit. And so if you come at it from the point of view of how do we engage that younger generation, I'm thinking specifically of talking, say, for example, tomorrow to Erin, who's 9, and she's going to be talking about at 3 o'clock about in primary school learning about World War II, which tends to be around the impact on the home front, young children being evacuated and stuff. And I was shocked to discover that up until 2014, it was compulsory, and then from 2014, it's no longer compulsory to teach World War II in primary schools. But a lot of primary schools still teach it because obviously the value that it has, I should imagine, around sort of, you know, citizenship and all those kind of things. How do you approach a subject like, you know, Northern Ireland or the Troubles through a conversation now with young people? I'm not talking necessarily about primary schools, maybe teenagers, which obviously would be along sectarian lines in Northern Ireland. But, you know, how would you teach it anywhere else in the world? What's your view on that?
It's probably easier anywhere else in the world in a way than it is in Northern Ireland. Just to go back to your point, I mean, I think we've talked about before that when you have basically 2 separate schooling systems, Catholic maintain one, and then one is seen as a Protestant sort of state maintained sector, and it's very hard to actually teach that in a way which acknowledges both sides. Arguably over here, in particular for mainland Britain, it would be easier for that to be taught to schools, while acknowledging the fact that unlike World War I or World War II, you know, there isn't perhaps a uniform agreed narrative on what actually happens and who was responsible and what happened. So, I mean, I kind of wonder, is digital media an underutilized resource? I mean, I think, you know, we've talked a lot about archives, and a lot of stuff that you've done with the centre, which is online, is a resource. And I think certainly thinking of the pandemic, we now have everyone homeschooling or using technology as part of it. I sort of wonder, are we missing a trick in terms of trying to push some of that education away from the traditional structures of schools, of institutions, and more towards Instagram, digital resources, databases where things are free, open, again, also open to be interpreted. And I think going back to our conversation, Instagram, it's crucially important in dealing with some of the examples of conflicts that we're going to talk about during the next 24 hours. There has to be an acknowledgement there's more than one story, there's more than one narrative. There are people whose experiences need to be documented and recognised, even if they're not the experiences that people who are looking at it can actually relate to. And you're right, with a 9-10-year-old or teenagers, we're now in Northern Ireland 22 years after the agreement. I mean, there are people who use the language of the conflict while not having any direct experience of it. And I do sort of wonder, I mean, there's a lot of understandable criticism from people who did experience the Troubles, of people who are 16, 17, talking as if the Troubles are still there, and about how there is perhaps an element of generational, you know, clamping down on that by saying to people, well, you didn't really experience that and you shouldn't make light of it. So maybe there is an educative purpose of having these sorts of resources and really making them as free and open as possible.
Now, as someone who works not only as a researcher but actually, you know, teaching at university, not so much undergraduates anymore, but certainly sort of master's level students, I mean, do you think we're missing a trick really, and maybe this is one of the things that we'll learn from COVID-19 and the pandemic, is the fact that, you know, people have to go off and explore for themselves rather than just learning facts and figures. History becomes very much about facts and figures. I know who started it, I know when it ended, I know how many people died, no real understanding what that number means to me unless I can relate it to what's the size of Man United Stadium times how many times is that, you know, then you kind of get some sort of context, and sort of the main protagonists, you know, who was good, who was bad, them and us, and what the impact's been. And by the way, here it is all wrapped up in a nice Hollywood movie ready for you to dissect and enjoy. But by the way, yeah, 9 of those 10 points are completely fabricated, you know. Actually, it's not really real. Yeah. And our narrative is then shaped by popular culture telling us that, you know, this is what this situation is. How do we use the natural way of how young people maybe use YouTube to go off and look at other stuff, willingly as well, to investigate and stuff, or maybe what hashtags are there for you to investigate stuff, in order to bring that sort of critical thinking, if you like, that desire to learn through the education system, so that when they arrive with us at university, that is something that you're not having to teach them. Because I find with a lot of undergraduates, there's an interest in certain things, but they know the answer and they're not willing to investigate maybe some other stuff as well. I mean, are you finding that with your students?
I think, yeah. I mean, for me, again, it comes back to something that you're doing. I think it's a very important and valuable job. Curating resources should be seen as something which is not a threat to higher or secondary level education. I mean, it should be something which is complementary to it and supports it. And I think it also is something that is not confined to those institutions. I mean, I think it's sort of this idea of sort of unmooring education from the fact that it has to be done in certain ways and ways that have always been done. I mean, one example that I always sort of think back to in terms of how to deal with the past when it is contentious, for me, would be Berlin. And I mean, go back to what we talked about earlier on about the wall, but if you go to Berlin and go to, you know, again, some of the information having the Holocaust and also on the Nazis there, we went there a couple of years ago, and again, there were school parties there, primary school age, who were going there as a trip, which is a very important thing. I do sort of wonder, is there a digital equivalent of that in terms of trying to use digital platforms to link to original resources? Images, yes. Video. I mean, I suppose we're talking through this 24 hours, but many conflicts where there are documentary evidence of it in digital form as well. I mean, I'm thinking back to again the former Yugoslav republics, where there's a lot of video out there. Making that open, but also perhaps not putting an agreed narrative around it, and actually saying to people that you should watch how this was reported. I think of Srebrenica, which we'll talk about tomorrow. I mean, the footage of that, certainly as a teenager watching that, certainly stuck with me. You know, it shaped my memory of that. And I do kind of wonder, when you're dealing with kids who are maybe 10, 15 years, you know, past that, who are reading in a book or looking at it in a classroom or in a lecture, they're probably missing a lot of that. So my approach is very much similar to yours, in that I think using digital technology to link to the original artifact, the blog, the news reports, that's a vital part of education and how we learn not to repeat those lessons and those issues about conflict again and again.
And I mean, your research around the Troubles obviously is from, you know, about a time and a place, both of which are, you know, known to you. So learning about sectarian or religious conflict in another scenario, in another country, in another time, do you think there's something to be learned in that way? So therefore you wouldn't learn about the Troubles because it's already too ingrained in the community or the community that you're from and popular culture that you choose to engage with a heavy overtone of an undertone, if you like, of religion, that actually it's too, you're immersed in it, so it's difficult to learn about it. So if you were to look at the sort of, you know, Israel-Palestine scenario, or maybe Kashmir or something like that, are there parallels to be drawn from that with the situation where you're drawing, where hopefully a light bulb goes on and goes, that's us, isn't it? That's us, you know, even though it's a different time and a different place.
To an extent, yeah. I mean, I think again it comes back to your, well, it goes to a certain extent goes back to your educational experience and what you were taught. I mean, we talked a bit earlier on about obviously the curriculum. I mean, that issue about World War I, World War II. I mean, a lot of people who are tuning into this will probably be quite shocked at that. The idea that it was removed with, and to see the reason behind it is kind of an important part of that. I mean, my experience of, I did politics A level, but it was a Northern Ireland Education Board who obviously administered it. We were taught a lot more about mainland Britain, Labour and Conservatives, than about a lot of the local stuff. I mean, I think that was deliberate because there was probably a sort of implicit message. Let's talk about the stuff that people are not going to have a very strong opinion on, because that's still relevant. It still affects how people in Northern Ireland were living day to day, but it wasn't going through the conflict all the time for the sake of it. I think we have to look for what commonalities there are between different conflicts, and I think certainly in terms of sectarianism, arguably that has shaped every conflict in the 20th century. In many cases, there's been an element of that where it's about othering and difference, and about those things being weaponized by very often political or military organizations for their own good. And I think, former Yugoslavia, Israel, Palestine, and a lot of people do draw the straight line there, perhaps in a way which is misleading, because they're all very different and they all have their own circumstances. And certainly I would be reluctant to say there's a comparison between Israel, Palestine and Northern Ireland in terms of the type of conflict it was, in terms of the scope. A lot of people in the Northern Irish context think they're in Israel, Palestine. I mean, there are loyalist areas that have Israeli flags, and there are Republican areas that have Palestinian flags, and still do. So again, there's an element where that is part of that war by another means, where it's using other conflicts as part of your own. So I think we have to probably be careful about saying it's identical, but there are clearly similarities. And I think that issue that you said earlier on about othering, I mean, at the root of every conflict, and every conflict we'll talk about in this newsroom, is that element of trying to dehumanize another group, to blame another group for your problems, for societal problems, rather than have a collective approach and a collective solution to it. And I think that's almost a recurring theme in all conflicts we've sort of talked about.
Final point before we finish this little segment of film. As someone who teaches digital advocacy, if you were to put together a module, for example, without putting you on the spot and going into too much detail, what do you think is what do you think are some of the main points that you'd need to get across when it came to using technology like Instagram and other forms of digital advocacy, when it came to memory and remembrance in general, but maybe drawing on some examples from Northern Ireland?
Ooh, good question. I mean, I think
that's the only time you've said that. You know that. That's the only one you've said good question to. I feel quite proud about that.
We'll do the trick, John, the magic circle trick. That's a pause for.
Yeah, you told me that before as well. Yeah.
Done that very well. I mean, I think for me, thinking about the tech side of it and social media platforms particularly, we all have to be critical of the platforms themselves. So, I mean, going back to the Instagram project, for example, people using the hashtag, there'll be things that aren't picked up for that. And I think we also have to be aware that if it's a commercial platform, it makes some things more visible and also. I think being critical of the platforms that we research, whether it's looking at how things are commemorated, looking at memory, looking at images, is crucial, because we're not looking at this in terms of that is definitely everything that's there. I always think that we're only looking at a very sort of small sample of it. I think with hashtags particularly, you're really looking at only skimming the surface. There's probably a lot of content that we're not seeing that isn't very visible, that isn't being shared or commented upon. And most research, I think, generally in sort of digital media, thinking about how we teach students how to be more critical and more social researchers, we miss a lot. And I think probably being aware of the limitations of that, and also the fact that they always talk about a long tail, where a lot of people on social media don't get visibility, don't attract other people. It doesn't invalidate them doing it. I sort of always think about if you have an Instagram feed which is private and you're sharing images like the ones we've talked about in the previous segment, that's still you making a memory. That's still you shaping it and sharing it.
Curating a narrative, And
if you have a private one, to me, that doesn't invalidate you doing that. Process is still yours. It's still about what you mean. You still might have a collective memory of it, but you're not sharing it publicly. So I think being aware that some people who might be the most visible and most seen are not representative is a crucial part of thinking about how it's used for memory making and memory sharing. And also, I think probably the issue about digital media, there are still a lot of people who do not use it, a lot of people who do not comment on it, who use it. We're only seeing fragments. And I think that sort of detailed look at what people, how they respond to it, is always the intriguing question for me. The difference in number of views, number of comments, and whatever platform you research, there's always lots of differences where you think, well, why did the 500 people who didn't comment on it, what they think?
Yeah.
Well, you don't ever know that answer. So I think being aware of the fact that we can only say so much based on what we can see is a really crucial part of educating any student on digital media and memory, or digital media and photography, like that project. And
it's interesting, one final point as well, interesting you were saying about ownership as well, because when you think about the many reports, from the UN as well, around the sort of the role of things like Facebook as a platform in being able to not only spread hate speech, but in many cases incite acts against Rohingya and things like that, and particularly in sort of India as well, that's actually owned by Facebook, Instagram. And at the moment, it's not really been touched on in any of these reports as playing a role. I mean, WhatsApp as well, isn't it, from a sort of messaging point of view? So two out of the three makes the third one not bad, or is that a case of that it's just not been evidenced as being as such?
I think that's an important point, because people are more aware that they're being watched on Facebook and those platforms, and on how their data is being used for advertising than they ever have been. So I think some of the media reports would suggest that we're all gullible or unaware are false. It's misleading. But that said, the fact that Facebook owns years of your memories, I mean, everyone who's watching this on Facebook Live, who has a Facebook account, probably like myself, you'll get memory on this day in 2011, you said this. And of course, the impetus there is to get us to share that memory, so to give them more information on us. So I always sort of think about their role as intermediaries is not as transparent as we might think it is. So it's never a neutral act. And I also wonder again, there will be people who might plausibly spend 20 or 30 years of their life with Facebook posts as an archive of embarrassing things they would not want to see again, or things that may, out of context, look bad. That goes back to the idea of prejudices, of values, of opinions shifting. That's an archive which isn't theirs only. That is Facebook's. Facebook does have that data. It has used that data. So I always sort of wonder, we need more critical of the platforms and how we use them, while acknowledging that there is a democratization of sorts. I mean, I think the idea we talked about earlier on is this is democratizing documentary media in a very positive way, in a way that wasn't possible. But there are caveats to it. And I think we have to be aware of the fact that we're not doing this with a neutral arbiter. These platforms are benefiting financially from what we're doing, even though we might benefit from it ourselves in terms of that memory making process.
Sarah, what I'm interested in asking you, Sarah, is, again, keeping on that kind of education side of, someone educated in mainland Britain like myself, you didn't really learn much about Irish history at all, and they're having the other half there. I mean, what is it you've learned from Paul about his childhood experiences, and his family experiences growing up in the Troubles, compared to what you thought you knew yourself, and then maybe watching that series, that Secret History series and stuff? I mean, what some comments can you draw from that?
Oh yeah, I suppose they're completely different in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm kind of very much remember watching the news when and the sort of reports that we'd see over here. But to be honest, a lot of the stuff was more in the background, I think, to a large extent. Like we didn't really in school, we didn't really kind of talk about it that much at all, really. And then I think all the little nuances I didn't really fully grasp until we kind of got together and you realised it wasn't as kind of black and white, or how divided everything was. Like I hadn't realised still how divided the society was really there to a large extent. Like the separate education, that was something that I found kind of very, very different to what I'd experienced and stuff. And I think it's all those sort of little things that I kind of hadn't realised till I was exposed to it all by meeting this lovely man. Yes.
Oh, that was a nice part. We'll cut that out and we'll send it to you. That's all right.
Put that bit out, definitely. Yeah, I don't want him to get too.
That's an edit there. Yeah.
One of the things you were saying as well that you told me to look at was about sort of the history of, like, you know, people, the places, and some of the events and stuff, with that sort of, you know, sounds of our years kind of stuff, with a background of music that we'd recognised, you know, or that happened when that was number one, that kind of thing. What kind of impact does that have on you? And then maybe we'll get Paul to answer that as well, because obviously you would both remember those years because of the music, but your situation would have been very different where you were living, and, you know, same for me, same for Jurian back in Holland, and that kind of stuff, you know?
Definitely. Well, I suppose when you hear the music, you have your own different memories. But I think particularly watching those Pops Northern Ireland, which kind of is a really interesting thing, because you have the music and kind of the events running alongside. And I think from my memories growing up is a lot of the inter-community deaths and the deaths and stuff was something that I didn't really remember seeing so much on media. I mean, if say somebody who was from the IUC or from the army were killed, and that was or something that happened on mainland England, yeah, very much that would be kind of on the news and a lot, but a lot of the kind of more, so say sort of intercommunal kind of deaths, I didn't really sort of imagine so much, and just sort of the violence of it really, and yeah, I think even though even still today though, I still kind of get quite shocked at times, like we tend to watch Northern Ireland BBC news and stuff here, and still how like so many like pipe bombs and things like that happen quite a lot, and I hadn't really realised that was still very much still happening today.
Yeah.
Just sort of that seems to have carried on. I found that very surprising as
and,
well.
And,
really.
and it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away, but it doesn't get reported, because it's a part of that narrative now, which is that there's peace and everybody's getting on.
Very much. It doesn't get covered at all. That's why I found it so shocking, definitely.
I suppose to offer a slightly different viewpoint. I mean, those programs, I mean, we watch them together, obviously, so they're things that I'm familiar with. I mean, obviously, having researched the Troubles and things like that as part of my PhD. Part of, I have a book, a chronology of the Troubles up to 1993, which is a very old document, given there was still 4 or 5 years to go before there was a peace. And the tit-for-tat nature, I think in certain years, particularly in the 1980s, which I do remember a bit more growing up, is in that format, in a 30-minute program with pop music and with other things. It shows you the sort of news at 10 and finally stories as well. So it isn't just about killing.
And other social events that were going on at the time, pop culture, if you like, and everything.
Yeah,
they kind of were weaved in between it all as well.
But the flip side of that, I'd argue, is that anyone who lived through the Troubles will probably say, well, yeah, for many people, they still did things that people did in England or Scotland. It wasn't a case that, I think the example I would give is when I went to university, there were people who would portray Belfast like it was Sarajevo in 93, which is not accurate either, because, in certain periods in the Troubles, yes, there were, daily bomb attacks, there were atrocities, but again, in perspective, for a lot of people, they went about their lives, they worked, they did things, they socialised, maybe in different circumstances. So I think it's probably that issue about how representative. So those programs, I think, try and show a bit more than just what happened in terms of terrorism or in terms of those things. And I think for most people, they probably had a mixed experience. They would, unless you didn't watch news programs, and obviously try to divorce yourself from that. And during the pandemic, a lot of people probably can relate to that feeling, not wanting to see that, being anxious about it. You were still touched by it, but they did do other things too. And I think that sort of suggestion about Belfast being like Sarajevo, I almost took offence at that, thinking, well, I'm sorry, but that's not actually accurate either. Sarajevo was, as you'll talk about tomorrow, I'm sure, with Kim and others, that was a very, very different situation to what was happening over 30 years in Northern Ireland, where it wasn't day by day. It wasn't as simple as that. So it's that issue you said earlier, John, about stereotyping. So Northern Ireland was nothing happening at all, or it was like Sarajevo and like the siege. It wasn't either. It was probably a bit of both. And it depended on what time you were looking at it, I think.
Interesting stuff, I think. You know what I mean? Like I said, it's every time you try and pick one of these themes, there's so much overlap between it, you know, so that like I said, that impact of people, you know, particularly that sort of post-traumatic, maybe not to a full-blown PTSD scenario, but certainly the impact of people of living in a heightened tension or, you know, worry and stuff like that, you know. And again, I think the long-term impact of people around sort of mental health. I mean, if we look at COVID-19 now, you know, the impact of mental health on people who probably don't acknowledge the fact that they have an existing or pre-existing mental health issue will have been impacted on the fact, particularly young children as well, of this sort of, you often think about this is like a scenario of a movie, you know, maybe not some of the things that are happening, but just that how everything has changed. Some of my best photos coming into the centre over the last 6 weeks to prepare for this have been standing in the middle of roads that are 4 lanes wide here in Leicester, and there's not a car either way, and I walk 25 minutes in and there's not a person. And I mean that's a scenario from a movie. And I think if you add into that, you know, the tension of, you know, explosions, danger, you know, Sniper Alley and all that sort of stuff with Sarajevo, then the impact on people, yeah, the creating of an ongoing issue that could create itself into a disability. And I know we're going to talk a lot about disability tomorrow, aren't we, Sarah? But, you know, it's one of those things, it's an underlying thing, isn't it?
I think you're right. I mean, Sarah will talk about it tomorrow as well on her bit, but I mean, collectively as a society, I think, again, it reflects the time that the Troubles happened as well. In the late 60s, early 70s, people weren't really talking about PTSD as something which could be treated, or something that, I mean, again, people were often told to man up, you know, if they were experiencing those things bluntly. You know, there was an element of it was seen as a non-condition. And I think in Northern Ireland, if you look at certainly the evidence, particularly in terms of suicide amongst young men in certain areas of North Belfast, which again is amongst the highest in the UK, there's a sort of combination of, you know, that is conflict legacy, also with things like socioeconomic deprivation and unemployment, which again people over here would be, you know, more familiar with. I mean, there's a element where people lived with it in the background for decades. That there was probably not until after 1998 a recognition that collectively people were experiencing PTSD, trauma, depression, and it was being recorded, and it's still probably not being fully recorded 22 years later. I don't think there has been an acknowledgement that people, whatever society, what part of society they were from, were collectively being traumatized by this conflict which lasted over 3 decades and did embroil most people there. So you're right. I mean, I think it's conflict legacy is perhaps almost as significant for some people as the conflict itself. And that probably applies to a lot of the conflicts we'll talk about today and tomorrow.
Cool. Thank you very much. That was very good. I really enjoyed that. Good. I'm glad we brought Sarah in. That kind of made it all make sense to me. Then it all kind of it brought a certain amount of clarity to the whole scenario.
Well, you're better looking at it too, so that's obvious.
You're much more knowledgeable than me.
It's obvious, you know.
Cool. I'll leave you two to it. Yeah. Cool.
No, it's all right. We both bring our positive attributes.
Cool. I'm looking forward to tomorrow as well, having a conversation about, you know, building on that whole kind of PTSD aspect around disability and how that's going to present itself to the NHS going forward, and also whether someone that has maybe served in Iraq or Afghanistan or any other conflict presenting themselves to the NHS 10 to 15 years after their service has finished, whether they'll mention their service or they will just present as someone that's got a mental health issue. It makes you wonder about how people sharing their records and all that sort of stuff. I've done a bit of work on that. Maybe we'll talk about that tomorrow as well.
Yeah, stigma and again societal prejudices as well.
Yeah.
But wouldn't you also find that in Northern Ireland, though, people sort of having to disclose kind of what role they had during the Troubles and stuff as well? I mean, that could obviously...
Yeah, that's true.
People don't really want to sort of disclose that really. A lot of the time it's something that happened, and now everything's, you know, means such a big thing. It's a label.
What is a victim?
What is a victim, exactly?
Yeah, not just somebody who's physically has an injury or a scar, somebody who has something which is not visible, and may not even be declared, because for a lot of people they don't declare those things openly, and again it's that male, again it goes back to that sort of stereotypical view that a man who expresses that and says I have mental health issues is seen as somehow
sign of weakness,
or weak, which is ridiculous, because obviously there's again decades of research showing that too. But I mean, with the women, again, with what you'll talk about tomorrow as well, I think there's an issue there about underrepresentation.
Yeah. Cool.
Good.
Right. Speak to you later. Thank you very much.